So I'd like to welcome everyone to our May 15th, 2024 Save the Pine Bush dinner. Our speaker is Neil Gifford. He's the Conservation Director of the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Management Commission. I'd like to make a couple of announcements. So tomorrow, Andy Arthur is going to sponsor a walk in the Pine Bush, and it should be really nice. It's an evening walk, and people can meet at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission, the Discovery Center, and it starts at 6:45. Unfortunately, also tomorrow night, there is a talk at the Discovery Center about the effects of climate change may have on the Pine Bush. The next announcement I have is that right now there are a lot of proposed developments in Colony. Most of the proposals are for warehouses, but there is a very large proposal, 75 acres as a solar farm. So if people would like to work on this project on trying to, what we'd like to do is to, prevent these developments because they do affect the pine bush. One of the problems with the pine bush is that there are approximately like maybe 5,500 acres of pine bush ecosystem left. And the problem that we have is that only about 3,500 acres are in the preserve. So we need to get more land in the preserve, but unfortunately the privately held pine bush ecosystem is being developed. So with that, I would like to welcome, let me see if I can get Neil. I'm going to see if I can, I'm going to remove, let me see, I'm going to remove the spotlight. And I'm going to highlight Neil. And I'm going to ask Neil to share his screen and unmute himself. And I'm really very, very pleased that Neil Gifford is here with us. So, Neil, can we hear you?
Yes, Lynn, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, I want to thank you for the invitation to tell the story of how we are working to reduce wildfire risk and restore ecosystem health and rebuild a resilient landscape in the Albany Pine Bush here in the capital city of Albany, New York. I would also be remiss if I don't start by saying that we are in the middle actually of our annual Lupin Fest, but Lupin Fest this year at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve is not just a one-day event. It is a month-long series of events, which includes my lecture tomorrow night on climate change of cardinal blue butterflies, but there are lots of wonderful things happening throughout the rest of the month. So I encourage you to visit our website. It's there on the title slide, albanypinebush.org, and check out the events calendar and see what's going on and what you might, hopefully some of your members might want to join us for some of the fun and educational things we've got going on throughout the month of May and actually into early June. But I also want to begin not only by thanking you for the invitation to speak tonight. It's always a pleasure to come and talk to Save the Pine Bush, but in particular because Save the Pine Bush and your advocacy was so critical to the protection of the preserve, the creation of the commission. In particular, it was your advocacy that led to the Gifford et al. Report that effectively said to, if we're going to save this ecosystem, we need at least 2,000 fire manageable acres protected. I'm happy to say that, as you'll see in a minute, the preserve is currently 3,400 and plus acres protected. But as you said, Lynn, there are still about 1,500 acres or so of unprotected pine bush left out there that we are actively working to try and add to the preserve. So I want to thank you and the members of the Save the Pine Bush for your continued advocacy on behalf of this globally rare ecosystem and the 114 rare species, including the cardinal blue, that depend on it for their existence. So thank you again for the invitation. But I also want to start, I usually put acknowledgments at the end, but I'm going to start with acknowledgments, and I'm going to try and do this from now on with all of my presentations, because I am just one person sitting before you this evening, representing a pretty amazing team of, and a pretty big and amazing team of folks, including our commission members, of course, our staff and volunteers, but also our partners, the New York State DEC, the New York State Office of Parks and Recreation and Historic Preservation, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the Nature Conservancy. But in particular, I want to thank our funders, the New York State Environmental Protection Fund, and of course the USDA's Wildfire Risk Reduction Grants, which have done so much to help us manage the ecosystem, and in particular, work to restore a functional fire regime. And you'll see more about that throughout my presentation. Use my mouse apparently. But I want to start with a little bit of context about northeastern pine barrens. I know that some of you are familiar with this and have seen this slide before, but perhaps not everyone. Northeastern pine barrens represent this suite of globally rare, isolated, fire-dependent ecological communities that, for their size, have a disproportionately large responsibility for protecting some of the world's rarest biodiversity. Pine barrens support a very large number of rare species, 114 rare wildlife species, and half a dozen rare plants in the Albany pine bush alone. But they are also long-lived, very stable ecosystems for wildlife that can't live in forests and don't live in grasslands. They live in that in-between habitat type that we frequently call early successional habitat. And pine barrens are really a long-lived and stable example of that kind of habitat, and supports a lot of species that are not yet rare, thankfully, but that also depend on this early successional or this in-between stage of habitat. And as the picture there illustrates, it's really kind of more of an open woodland on top of a grassy shrubland or a shrubby grassland. But we've lost an awful lot of the pine barrens, not just here in the Albany pine bush, but throughout the Northeast since the 1960s. And they are all currently conservation reliant because, as you'll see, the Northeast is one of the most populated sections of the country, of the continent, I might say. And we can't just let wildfire run amok, run the landscape the way it did historically. So that means they're all conservation reliant. If these places and the plants and animals that depend on them are going to persist and not go extinct, it's going to be up to all of us to continue to advocate for responsible management of these systems. And the pine bush is just one example of that. And in particular, one of the unique things about pine barrens in the Northeast is that there is no reference community. So we are managing for a desired future condition that we don't fully understand. While we understand a lot of the basics of fire ecology and individual ecology of many of these species, none of us managing pine barrens have a large, fully functional pine barren site that supports large viable populations of all these rare species. What we inherited are these small fragments that were degraded and that support small remnant, barely hanging on populations of some of the rarest wildlife in the Northeast. And we'll come back around to this reference community and the implications of that in understanding whether or not we're actually advancing ecosystem health or not. I keep trying to use my keyboard and that's not working. But all of these pine barrens have one thing in common, and that is, well, really two things. They are relics of soils. Almost all of them exist on glacial outwash sands and gravels, or basically excessively well-drained glacial outwash soil. But also, they are relics of what we now understand to be indigenous fire stewardship or indigenous fire keeping. And in particular, here in Albany, the Albany pine bush sits within really the heart of the Delaware Nation historically, but specifically part of the Delaware Nation were the Stockbridge, Muncie community of Mohican Indians. And the Mohican, the Mohicans were, their government, if you will, was centralized on the Schodack Islands, and in particular the Papscony Island, which State Parks and OSI have donated back to the Mohican people. So they now have, again, a footprint on the landscape, a present day footprint on the landscape. And to learn more about Indigenous fire stewardship, I would encourage you to read any one or all three of these three books, which are absolutely phenomenal resources. But as you know, the indigenous people that were here, the Mohicans and later the Haudenosaunee, or specifically the St. Regis Mohawks, were all forcibly removed, and it was kind of a failed attempt at genocide. But they are no longer largely within much of their historical footprint that was here, pre-contact. And one of the ways that we understand that the role of Indigenous fire stewardship, besides the literature, is that central picture there is a sediment core taken from the Pine Barrens Vernal Pond, right behind the Discovery Center in the Carner Barrens East. This is working with Kurt Steger and one of his graduate students from Paul Smith's College. And in just under a meter of sediment, they carbon dated this, and they had 6,600 years of record, and that record contained a continuous record of fire history. And here and so many other places across North America, that fire history could only have been maintained through indigenous firekeeping, the people's intentional use of fire. Lightning alone could not have maintained the kind of fire frequency that we're seeing within these sediment cores and within, in many places, tree rings of very old trees. But the Mohican people are still very much around. They are physically now back here, they were relegated to a reservation in Wisconsin. That was their fourth move, their fourth forced move from their ancestral lands, was ultimately to a reservation in eastern Wisconsin. And we are working to try and reconnect with them and connect them with this landscape. But pitch pine scrub oak barrens, the Albany pine bush in particular, is one of the best remaining global examples of an inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens. It's also the place name or the type locality for the Carner blue butterfly. It's the first place the Carner blue was ever identified. And the pine bush supports thousands of species, many considered at risk, and that includes 114 rare wildlife species, ranked S1 through S3 by the New York Natural Heritage Program, and 74 wildlife species that New York State considers species of greatest conservation need. And evidence suggests that there was at least 25,000 acres of pitch pine scrub oak barrens here originally. Of that, as you said at the beginning, Lynn, there are fewer than 6,000 acres remaining. And of that, much was degraded due to fire suppression, invasive species, overabundant native species, and habitat fragmentation. And as I said earlier, your advocacy ultimately led to the law, New York State Environmental Conservation Law, Article 46, that created the preserve and the commission and the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission. The commission is chaired by DEC, co-chaired by State Parks. It includes the county executive of Albany County, the mayor of the city of Albany, the two supervisors for the towns of Gillett and Colony, and the state director of the Nature Conservancy, as well as 4 private citizens appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate. And this is our vision map. Many of you have seen this map before, but as you can see, we don't have the luxury of one contiguous block of open space. We have this postage stamp sized relic of the pine barrens that were once here, and that postage stamp has been dissected into a bunch of pieces. So we have a bit of a jigsaw puzzle that we're working to put together as we build the preserve. Currently 3,400 acres in size. Ultimately, we're hoping for a preserve, working toward a preserve, I should say, of a little over 5,300 acres. And the commission's goals for the preserve are really twofold, and these come more or less directly out of the law. One is managing the preserve for a viable and healthy ecosystem, and we'll talk more about that, obviously, in a few minutes. But those ecological goals are really designed around ecosystem dynamics. Even though the Carner blue was listed as endangered in 1977, the law only talks about managing pitch pine scrub oak barrens and managing it with fire. But we also have programmatic goals in the law, and that's that the preserve is managed also for its educational and recreational benefits, public benefits. And you can learn more about that. If you go to the website, you can find our management plan, and there's a lot more information there. But as I said, pine barrens are fire dependent, and we have been using prescribed fire here since 1991. And initially, in those first few years, it was a very limited window early in the season, early in the spring, this time of year, about 2 months, April and May. And what we learned, what we saw with fires then, we were successful in putting fire on the ground, but those dormant season fires, before things green up, produce, and with decades and decades and decades of accumulated fuel, much like what you see in the news now of the catastrophic fires out west, large amounts of fuel burning in the dormant season before green up led to very high rates of spread. That's the ROS on the slide, rates of spread, and high flame lengths, which led to some pretty stressful prescribed fires for the staff and crew here, but also produce, as you can see, a decent amount of smoke. And so not only were these fires stressful, but they were also only marginally effective. They were good at maintaining the pitch pine scrub oak thickets, like you can see in the upper left-hand slide there. To give you a sense of scale, the young man in the blue jacket is about 6 feet tall, a little over 6 feet tall. So what we inherited was really a scrub oak thicket, not so much a pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And those early dormant season fires were great at maintaining that condition, but they only top killed the above ground vegetation. They didn't help thin the vegetation the way we needed it to be able to expand lupin or get pitch pine regenerating. They did not expose mineral soil, which is essential to many of the native plants here if they're going to persist in the long term. And in many cases, they actually made some of the invasive species issues worse. If you think about it, in the dormant season, the plants are more or less asleep. What you do above ground doesn't really matter all that much because they've already have all their energy and carbohydrates and whatnot stored in the bank in the roots. So dormant season fires were only marginally effective and pretty stressful. As a result of that, it led to some experimentation in about 2003, where we looked at trying to create more effective and more manageable, less stressful fires. And so we did an 8-acre experiment where we mowed 8 acres of pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And then once everything had greened up in August, we burned half of it. And right away, we saw, as you can see in that third slide on the top there with the fire in the August picture, gave us some really nice fire behavior. We had flame lengths that were only about 4 to 6 feet tall. But in particular, because everything was green, you could almost outwalk those fires. Very, very slow-moving fires. But they were slow-moving because they were sitting at one spot for a long time. Because in order for the fire to advance, it has to evaporate all that water that's in the green foliage, right? Green vegetation, like us, is mostly water. So in order for the fire to advance, it needed to evaporate all that water. So we ended up with very manageable fire, and that in a single treatment met a number of our objectives that we had wanted to reach for a long time and could not with repeated dormant season fire. And in particular, one of the things we were trying to do was create some change in the vegetation structure, trying to open up the scrub oak canopy, open up the pitch pine canopy, expose the mineral soil, reduce the litter and the decades of accumulated organic matter that in some cases were almost a foot thick. And that upper left-hand slide there, that the dots and the triangles, the fact that the dots and the triangles are not partying together, but they're separated, tells us that there was a big difference between the treatment types. And you can see that in the lower left. In particular, if you look at the litter depth, duff depth, and amount of bare ground, we eliminated the litter and duff in the mow and burn sites and exposed a good deal of bare ground, which was something we had wanted to do for a very long time. But what we didn't want to do was alter the plant species composition much, and that's what that lower right-hand illustration is showing you, that scatter plot. And in this case, you've got the circles and the triangles dancing together, which means effectively there's not a whole lot of difference in the vegetation in the plant species composition between the two treatment types. So essentially, the data showed us that we altered the structure in ways that we wanted to, but did not really alter the plant species composition in ways that we didn't want, which was a great result. So that 8 acres led to a pretty significant paradigm shift in our management, and realizing that fire alone was not going to get us where we thought we needed to go. Fire alone was not going to be effective at restoring ecosystem health to the world's best remaining example of a pitch pine scrub oak barrens. So now we utilize these techniques, a combination of mechanical, like mowing, and silvicultural treatments, to rearrange fuels, eliminate some invasive species, and create fuels that give us manageable fire behavior, as well as some herbicide work, both to eradicate invasive species, but also to thin some of the overabundant natives like scrub oak. And then follow that up with prescribed fire and seeding. And in places where we had black locust, as many of you know, there's really nothing native left underneath black locust. It completely alters ecosystem composition and structure. It destroys the soil system. So in that case where we remove black locust, there's pretty much almost nothing native left. So we're planting a pretty broad suite of native grasses, wildflowers, pitch pine and scrub oak. And in the high quality barrens, after fire, when we remove the litter and duff and exposed mineral soil, we're just interseeding the barrens with wild blue lupin to try and expedite the recovery of the cardinal blue butterfly. And this paradigm shift has been unbelievably successful. Within the preserve, and here on these maps, the kind of that gray shaded puzzle inside the red line is the protected land, 3,400 acres. And you can see we've thin native forests, both white pine and oak forests that had pitch pine, scrub oak barrens, remnants left in them, but also closed canopy pitch pine forests. And we'll come back to that because that's particularly important. And you can see the before and after on the bottom there with the pitch pine forests before and after were pretty much, it's instant barrens. And the native plants, except for lupin, come back tremendously. So again, in those places, after we burn, we're interseeding lupin and getting cardinal blue butterfly habitat. But we've now removed a little over 400 acres of black locust and thin scrub oak on a little more than 350 acres. So we're really starting to manage at the appropriate scale for the preserve. And as you'll see, getting some pretty dramatic effects and positive effects. In particular, these growing season fires, both in the restoration phase and in the maintenance phase, are much more manageable. Here you can see in that biggest photograph, you're looking at a growing season fire in a management unit we called Friendly. We're in region F, so all the management units begin with F. But Friendly is sandwiched right between the New York State Thruway. You're looking east here toward the Albany landfill, or what I've heard some of you refer to as Mount Trashmore. And in the foreground, you've got Albany County Route 155, which runs kind of north-south. The Thruway, of course, runs east and west. And you can see in an incredibly difficult spot, we were able to effectively manage some high-quality barrens with these growing season fires. And the other photographs, you can see smoke management is actually smoke management is better. We have better lift and dispersal and management of the smoke with these fires, better fire behavior, and phenomenal fire effects. And as you can see, the staff here, including our fire manager on the left, Tyler Briggs, are happy because these fires are not nearly as stressful following all those mechanical treatments as they used to be when we first started doing this. And that's allowed us to put a lot more fire on the ground, in particular because not only because we're burning now, not only in the dormant season, but also in the growing season. So we've expanded our burn window from 8 weeks in the early spring to effectively year round. We'll burn whenever we get conditions that are within our permit, or what we would call within prescription, including this year for the first time in February. And that's allowed us to increase the acreage burned. And Gifford et al., the paper that I referenced earlier, said we should be burning, if we have 2,000 fire manageable acres, we should be burning at least 200 acres a year, or 10% of the barrens. So currently we're at a little 3,400 acres, and we're now getting up to around 300 to 400 acres a year. And I apologize, we frequently use metrics when we're presenting these slides at scientific conferences. So the unit on the left there is hectares. A hectare is a metric unit of area, and it equals about 2.5 acres. So 150 hectares is roughly a little over almost 300 to 400 acres a year. So tremendously successful in getting effective fire on the ground. So now we're using growing season fire largely in the restoration phase as we're trying to reset things, and dormant season fire more in the maintenance phase of things where we just want to, that kind of high frequency light fires, just get rid of a couple of years of accumulated litter and dust and keep the system functioning and healthy. And this pyrodiversity is really essential to restoring ecosystem health. What we have learned in the Northeast and throughout the Southeast and many other parts of the country is that Indigenous fire stewardship was a fire regime of very high frequency, low intensity, low severity fire. And Gifford et al. Said we should, any given spot in the preserve should be burning at least once every 10 years. And we're realizing now that it's more likely about once every 3 to 5 years if we're really going to manage and maintain high quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens, cardinal blue butterfly habitat, and habitat for many of these other rare wildlife species, while eliminating and keeping invasive plants out. This high frequency will maintain low fuel loads and allow us to continuously kill any new invasive plants that try and get started, any locust seedlings, bittersweet seedlings, anything like that comes in. This high frequency fire regime will keep them at bay. But are we really advancing ecosystem health, and how do we know? So there are principally two ways that we try and evaluate this. If you've read the management plan, there is a Pine Barrens viability assessment in there, a lot of great information, but ultimately it's still based on a review of the literature. Like all of you, I live in a house or an apartment for some of you. The wildlife are living in this ecosystem 24/7, for some of them 365 days a year. So we realized that the two best ways to evaluate ecosystem health are really to look at the distribution and area of the successional stages of pitch pine scrub oak barrens, and secondly, the distribution and abundance of the rare wildlife, and in particular, those wildlife species that truly depend on pitch pine scrub oak barrens, like the ones you see here: hognose snakes, carnival butterflies, a bunch of the birds, including prairie warblers, and other insects like the inland barrens buck moth. Because absent a reference community, those wildlife population dynamics are really our best vital signs, if you will, of ecosystem health. If their distribution and abundance is going up, we know that we're managing and moving the system in the right direction. So we do a lot of wildlife monitoring. So first, I want to think about the successional stages. There are, according to the New York Natural Heritage Program, which classifies ecological communities, there are 4 successional variants. So you can think of these as 4 age classes of pitch pine scrub oak barrens, which effectively are individual ecological communities in their own right. So early on, you're looking at successional northern sandplain grasslands, then pitch pine scrub oak barrens, pitch pine scrub oak thickets, and pitch pine scrub oak forest. As you can see with the numbers at the bottom along the arrow there, illustrating the successional variants, in 1990, there were some grassy openings in the frost pockets between the dunes, but essentially no successional northern sandplain grasslands of a sufficient size to be classified as such. There were only about 13 acres of true barrens, and that's that grassy shrubland or shrubby grassland. And you can see how it's defined there by the Heritage Program with the pitch pine overstory cover, the scrub oak cover, and the grassland matrix. Ultimately, we're looking at 20 to 60% cover of pitch pine and between 25 and 50% cover of scrub oak and other native woody shrubs. You then get into pitch pine scrub oak thickets, and we inherited a lot of this when we started. And that's a closed canopy pitch thicket of scrub oak underneath that open canopy of pitch pine. And in places that in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s had lots of lupin and carnival butterflies, when the preserve began in the 90s, most of what we had as far as the open habitat were these closed canopy thickets, and there's no way that the grasses and wildflowers will grow under a canopy of scrub oak. It simply can't happen. And then lastly, as a result of fire suppression, we inherited an awful lot of forest. So if you look at the difference between those 1990 numbers and the numbers we had in 2020 when we last calculated this, and we do that every 5 years, we're now looking at, we have more forest because we added more land to the preserve, for one. But in particular, we have a lot more true barrens and successional sandplain grassland as a result of management. And ultimately, we're looking at maintaining some of each of these successional variants, but we know that for the most part, it's the grasslands and the barrens, the true barrens, that support the highest quantities of the rare species and the largest populations of those species. And we still have a wild card. We're trying to figure out what ultimately the maintenance fire regime or fire frequency for these systems are. But that's our kind of our working hypothesis: the 3, 5, 10, and 20-year fire frequency. So we're mapping and looking at the distribution, and that has improved over time. We're also evaluating individual plant responses. And if you've been to the preserve recently, and you'll see some maps in a second, we have those growing season fires in particular, and the mechanical chemical pretreatments to growing season fire have allowed us through seeding to dramatically expand the amount of lupin on the landscape. When I started here, and many of you will remember the 4-acre paved parking lot I was charged with restoring, and successfully did in the early 1990s, to carnival butterfly habitat. So we ripped up a parking lot and restored it to paradise. But we've been able to expand lupin now to about 800 acres in the preserve. And as you'll see, that's had a phenomenal impact on carnival butterfly recovery and viability, but also other really important plant species responses. In particular, we are now finally getting really nice pitch pine recruitment that we never saw with dormant season fire alone. Exposing the mineral soil has allowed the pitch pine to regenerate, can't have a viable pine barrens if you don't have your core plant species, in particular the pines and the oaks, regenerating. But we've also seen a phenomenal response in New Jersey tea. New Jersey tea is a fire-dependent plant. It banks its seeds, waiting for a fire. It takes the heat of a fire to crack the seed coat in order for that plant to thrive. And New Jersey tea is an incredibly important plant because it is the sole food plant for another rare butterfly, the mottled dusky-winged skipper. And you can see a picture of that little brown butterfly. It's about almost twice the size of a carner. And the experts, the entomologists in the Northeast, believe that we have probably the largest population of New Jersey tea and the largest population of mottled dusky-winged skippers anywhere in their range. And we've seen some pretty remarkable things like Virginia marble seeds show up in the preserve in places that we've been managing the hardest and the most frequently with mechanical and fire and using all of our tools. This plant was considered extirpated from New York State, and we rediscovered it in Carner Barrens East just a few years ago. Virginia marble seed is another fire-dependent plant. So we're seeing great responses, which are phenomenal indicators of improving ecosystem health, both in the plants, but also in the wildlife that depend on them. And it's been a game changer. This paradigm shift has been a game changer in recovering the Carner blue butterfly. Growing season fire in particular, as you can see here, this was a May fire from 2018. Everything was green then by May 18th. That year must have been a little early. But you can see how succulent the lupin is. Those dense patches of lupin don't burn, and that creates refugia inside a management unit for Carner blue butterflies and frosted elphins. Dormant season fire, before things are green, would have burned all of that habitat and killed all the Carner blues and frosted elphins in that management unit. We manage that by never treating more than a third of a given subpopulation, and we don't treat adjacent thirds in consecutive years. Lupin's a perennial. It comes back better than ever after fire. It's more nutritious, more palatable. Caterpillars that feed on lupin sprouting up after a fire, those females will lay a lot more eggs, but no life stage of Carner blue butterfly can survive fire. So these growing season fires, we've learned that we can maintain little pockets of lupin even within management units simply because they're too succulent to burn. And that's been phenomenal in seeing a Carner blue butterfly and frosted elfin response. And creating a mosaic or a diversity of fire effects, which is ideal. It's allowed us to extend the growing season for lupin. Lupin that sprouts up after a fire stays green until frost. Lupin that does not experience fire will die back in early July. And as I said, it improves lupin nutrition. But ultimately, what this does from an ecosystem health perspective is it creates greater resiliency within the ecosystem for these rare butterflies. Because now you've got lupin in the landscape in spots, in patches, all summer long into the fall. So if you have late season Carner blue butterflies, they have food, females have places directly to lay their eggs. They don't have to lay their, typically in unburned sites, females in the July brood are laying their eggs on grasses and things, hoping, their butterflies will find lupin in the spring. But if lupin is still up and green, females will prefer to lay their eggs right on that. And like I said, we now have 800 acres of lupin in the preserve that we're effectively managing with fire. And that's had a phenomenal response on the Carner blue butterflies. The minimum recovery threshold is 3,000 butterflies in 4 to 5 years. We broke through that ceiling in 2013 and have maintained well over 10,000 butterflies a year ever since. And in particular, I want to point out that these numbers are conservative in that while we have about 800 acres of occupied habitat in the preserve, we're only able to physically sample. We're only able to physically sample about 15% of that habitat. So these numbers only relate to the area we physically sample. The real number of Carner blue butterflies in the preserve is something higher than 10 to 40,000. And 2020 was just a phenomenal year. And like we can talk about that in the Q&A later if you want. But obviously it's not just about Carner blues, right? Carner blues, like so many things in ecosystems, right? Their decline, while a problem in itself, we're really a symptom of a much bigger problem of poor ecosystem health. So Carner blue butterfly recovery is a good sign of improving ecosystem health. But of course, as I said, the pine bush supports a large diversity of other rare wildlife. So we do a lot of monitoring of a number of different species, both in-house and with our academic and agency partners like SUNY ESF and the New York State DEC and others. And what we found is that overall, we have one of the most diverse populations of native bees. Amanda Dillon, our former preserve ecologist and entomologist, who's now working for DEC in their entomology lab, she identified over 260 species of native bees alone from the Albany pine bush. Another graduate student discovered over 50 native species of ants in the preserve. The same story with the rare moths. And in particular, there were a couple of moths that were rediscovered after being absent here for several decades, like the wax sallow moth. And Tim McCabe from the New York State Museum rediscovered the Henry's elfin right outside the Discovery Center in 2012. So again, no matter how you slice it, ecosystem health seems to be improving when you look at the distribution and abundance of the wildlife that need the habitat. We also do a lot of work with birds, and birds that specialize on this habitat are doing very well. Prairie warblers in particular, our research and others show that prairie warblers are one of the best indicators of pitch pine scrub oak barrens. We now have several hundred pair of prairie warblers in the preserve. We have to update this slide. And other pine barren specialists as well. And the eastern whippoorwill that had been absent again for like 30 years or so, now is reestablishing a breeding population in the preserve to the point where we're catching birds, putting GPS data loggers on them to be able to look at how they're interacting with the habitat and specifically with our habitat management. And these birds are literally responding within a year to our forest thinning and prescribed fire work. And the population every year seems to be going up. And it's been interesting to look at how these birds are interacting with our management. And whippoorwills were a really enigmatic species that used to keep people up at night. They were kind of an icon of pine barrens and open oak woodlands that had been, and the evening skies were silent here for far too long. But if you come for a walk at night now, particularly in the western sections of the preserve, like in Truax Barrens or out in Madison Avenue Pinelands, you're very likely to hear whippoorwills, especially if the moon is up. And don't just take my word for it and the commission's word. We were part of a 20-state project looking at, for 5 years, looking at managed barrens and grasslands across the Northeast. And we were all stunned. The pine bush stands out as one of the best sites among all of the sites for both the native bees and the native moths within all of these sites that we're managing. So this, small fragmented urban remnant is still big enough. Thankfully, Gifford, said we needed to protect at least 2,000 fire manageable acres, and it's working. We have through our management, we have been able to maintain and expand populations of all of these species. So this alone, not only looking at what we have here, but comparing the pine bush to these other sites is further illustrating just how much we are improving ecosystem health within the Albany pine bush. And most recently, the news we got from the New York State DEC's Bureau of Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health was really kind of startling. And they were a little shocked, and which is why they got a hold of me with this quote. If you don't know about southern pine beetle is a native bark beetle to the southeastern United States and had been as far north as southern New Jersey. And it's moving north, and it's moving into the Long Island pine barrens. You can see on the map there, and all the way up into the Concord pine barrens of New Hampshire. And it's moving into overstocked, very dense stands of pitch pine and decimating them. That picture on the left there, what the forest health people call a spot. What you're looking at is probably 1 to 2 growing seasons of death within pitch pine trees. When southern pine beetle moves in, it attacks pitch pine trees, it releases an aggregating pheromone, and the beetles attack the pitch pine trees and kill them within a single growing season. But again, this is a native bug moving north as a result of climate change, principally, into ecosystems it had not been in before and really decimating them. And there's an awful lot of work happening on Long Island in particular because it's the threat to the Long Island pine barrens is pretty significant. So we're one of a number of sites that they've been monitoring for quite a while. And what they found is while southern pine beetle is here and has been here now for almost a decade, they found they're not only collecting in their traps southern pine beetle, they're also looking at other native bark beetles. And what they found was that we have the healthiest southern pine beetle predator population and their native competitors of any of the sites that they're monitoring. So again, thinning the forest, getting rid of the black locust and other invasives, managing these sites with fire is improving its resilience to this new potential threat. And they expect that southern pine beetle here isn't going to be the devastating force that it is in Long Island, because we have already thinned our pitch pine forests and we manage them with fire. And as a result of that, we have a very healthy native bark beetle population of competitors and predators to keep this new bark beetle in check. And that's a great indicator of ecosystem health. And the part of the issue on Long Island is that the pitch pine forests are not managed with fire. There are far too many trees per acre. And the way the aggregating pheromone works best in closed canopy forests like this, where the wind is not dissipating that pheromone, that perfume, if you will. And fire and thinning reduces the stand density, making the trees that we leave stronger and more resilient, both to fire, but also to southern pine beetle, because they have more nutrition and more water. The pitch pine's primary method of getting rid of beetle attacks is to pitch them out. So you can see that in that little inset photo. When a beetle attacks, the tree uses water to produce sap and pitch to literally push them out. And in dense stands like you see in that photograph of overstocked pitch pine, there's simply not enough water to go around, and the trees are water deficient, and the beetle can decimate the stand. So we were quite pleased to get that note from DEC this winter. But of course, managing this ecosystem is not all about maintaining ecosystem health is not all about the wildlife. It's also about fire. And obviously, we're doing this in the capital city of New York State, in a fragmented urban preserve where the New York State Thruway cuts through the middle of it. So everything we do is as much about connecting and engaging with people as it is about the fire and the plants and animals we're managing for. So we do an awful lot of education and outreach, like this presentation, but also this postcard reaching out to more than 7,000 of our neighbors every year, reminding them of what we're doing with prescribed fire. But also we do a lot of work with signage and information on our website and whatnot to keep people informed, so that when they see the changes happening on the landscape, they can understand what's happening and why, right? It's not, when we remove a black locust clone, some people think we're going to build something. It's actually effectively getting rid of a non-native invasive weed so that we can restore carnival butterfly habitat and pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And of course, many of you have seen Tyler and me and others on the local news. One of the advantages of being in Albany is that we have 3 network affiliates here that do a phenomenal job of helping us get the word out by covering events and activities and management in the preserve. And we very much appreciate their interest and their effort to bring our story to the Capital District residents. And that's had a pretty profound impact on people's understanding of what we're doing. This was a master's thesis out of Cornell University, their Human Dimensions Research Unit. And what they found, they did a study within 10 miles of the preserve. And what they found was that there was an awful lot of support and awareness of the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, our burning and our invasive species removal, but less well understood was why we were cutting trees in a nature preserve or mowing. So, and this study has actually helped us continue to refine our education and outreach materials to try and better tell that story and keep people better informed. And that seems to be working. And many of you will remember last year, and unfortunately it may happen again this year, there are already hundreds of wildfires in central and western Canada currently, dumping smoke into the Midwest. But if you remember the smoke from last year, and that photograph, that's not mist, that is Canadian wildfire smoke from June 30th last year, when I was out doing bird surveys just at sunrise. And I don't know if all of you saw it, but the Altamont Enterprise ran an editorial about the Canadian wildfire smoke, which was a relatively long, great piece. But one of the things they included is that they commended the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission on our fire management, on our responsible fire management, to quote them. And they talked about the Carner Blue, of course, but mentioned, and specifically, that our work here with the Albany pine bush and managing the Albany pine, the pitch pine scrub oak barrens is we're more than just saving the cardinal blue butterfly and other at-risk and species that are at risk of extinction with our burning, but we're actually saving ourselves and protecting us from catastrophic wildfires locally, but also maintaining and managing this system so that if and when wildfires do occur, they're not the major conflagrations like we see out west in Canada. They are light surface fires that are much easier to manage and control.
I made
No, I'm not sure who I can hear, but if you could mute, that would be fantastic. And lastly, we are seeing other signs of community support as a result of our work and our communications. And we updated our fire management plan in 2023. And the one comment, it was nice that we publicized that thing for a month and a half. We got one comment, and they included this quote. I see huge wildfires in the news and feel very proud that my local community manages this threat so efficiently. And while this is not an endorsement, if you're familiar with the Fort Orange Brewing Company last year, they came out with a Pine Bush Pilsner, a wonderful. I can't endorse it. It is a nice Pilsner with a beautiful label from a local microbrewery here in Albany. And I don't know that there's much more of a symbol of the level of support for what we're doing in protecting and managing the Albany Pine Bush than these kinds of quotes, and seeing that something like this Pilsner be marketed so beautifully at the local microbrewery. But of course, there are outstanding questions, and one of them I mentioned earlier. We're still trying to dial in and figure out what the ideal fire regime is, and in particular, how frequently do we really need to be managing any given spot with fire? Following the examples of the southeastern coastal plain, the pine systems there, the ponderosa pine forests, and similar ecosystems out west, it's actually a very, very high frequency, 3 to 5 year fire frequency, high frequency, very light surface fires to maintain these ecosystems and keep the fuel loads low enough where wildfires aren't really a problem while managing and maintaining habitat for all these rare species. Climate change, of course, is a real wild card. And the predictions are for increased fire probability moving forward, which means it's even more important for us to be continuing to manage the site with prescribed fire to keep those fuel loads low, so that as the probability of wildfire increases here, we don't actually see that manifest itself. We can mitigate that risk by utilizing prescribed fire and managing frequently. Dealing with threats like southern pine beetle, which I already talked about. But also, one of the wild cards is thinking about the rare species that are here now and the species that may need this place in the future. What you're looking at with these two maps, excuse me, is a model that those of us on the federal cardinal blue butterfly recovery team put together, and specifically this was the USGS and folks at the University of Notre Dame. They looked at where conures are today and mapped and measured the climate footprint of existing conure habitat. That's the black dots. And then mapped that out, what is the footprint of those conditions currently? And it matches the historical range of cardinal blue butterflies very, very well. And then they modeled that forward, given the climate scenarios and the probable climate footprint that we will be seeing, by 2080. And even the most conservative estimates illustrate that there's a high probability that the cardinal blue butterfly climate envelope by 2080 is going to have migrated much farther north. But cardinal blues are not going to be able to follow that by themselves. A typical adult butterfly only lives 3 to 5 days. They don't travel more than a few hundred meters within that lifespan. So that means that we're going to need to be thinking about, and already are thinking about at the federal level, of creating cardinal blue butterfly habitat farther north. And those new habitat sites to the north are going to need source populations to be able to move butterflies from and into that new habitat. And that means managing for very large viable populations where the butterflies exist today and keeping them here as long as possible is going to ensure or increase the probability that there are cardinal blue butterflies around in 50 to 60 years, 70 years to move to new habitat farther north. But realize, of course, climate change is happening globally. And this story is also true for species that are currently south of us, that live in other similar, pine habitats, pine grassy shrubby habitats to our south. And so there are very likely species to our south that will need a place to move to in the future. So continuing to manage and maintain a healthy pitch pine scrub oak barrens will increase and improve the likelihood that some of those species that are south of us now have a place to move to in the future. So in conclusion, I just want to say that, we've gone through a pretty big paradigm shift in almost 30 years of managing this site. And we're actually one of the national leaders. The first place I gave this talk actually was at a national conference. But those pre-treatments, right? Those mechanical and chemical pre-treatments are absolutely essential to reversing decades of fire suppression and deteriorating ecosystem health. We've realized that restoration phase is very, very different from the maintenance phase. And you can liken that to if you get sick, excuse me, and if the flu or COVID is a worst case scenario, what it takes to get you healthy if you're that sick is very, very different than what it takes to keep you healthy if you're healthy. And ecosystems are similar. What it takes to restore ecosystem health is pretty significant and more heavy-handed than what it takes to maintain a healthy ecosystem in a healthy state. But ultimately, monitoring fire effects in wildlife is our best window into understanding how we're improving ecosystem health. And the long and short of it is community engagement is critical to all of that work. Without community support, we cannot do the work that we need to do to save this place and the species that depend on it. And lastly, and again, this was for that national audience, but if we can do this here, look at that photograph. All that development around us, a golf course, a thruway, office buildings, residential commercial development. If we can do this successfully here within this relatively small, fragmented urban landscape, I dare say it can be done just about anywhere. And the reality is, we are now in the Anthropocene. So maintaining ecosystem health in many ecosystems now really requires active human intervention. The reality is it always did. I mean, indigenous people were managing these landscapes for centuries, if not millennia, pre-contact. So really, it's going to take all of us to continue to advocate and to do the work that needs to be done to understand what it is, understand these ecosystem dynamics and how to maintain them and improve them so that we can push back against the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis and keep these species and these habitats around for our children and our children's children. And with that, I again want to thank you, Lynn, for the invitation. It is always a pleasure to come and speak to Save the Pine Bush. And if we have time left, I would be happy to entertain any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Neil. I really appreciate it. We definitely, let me see, there is why, let me think about that. I'm not sure what people are seeing right now, but
I'm going to turn the chat on too, in case we get any questions in the chat.
Yeah, that would be good. And let's see. Why don't I see what was this? There we go. All right. So there you are. So we're back to Neil. Does anyone have any questions? If you want, I think people can raise their hand, or let me see. We have one from let me see. How about this one? What is going on along Carter Road where a clear cut seems to be taking place?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, two things are going on there. Can you still hear me, Lynn?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's two things going on.
Hang on a second. Some people still haven't muted themselves, and we're getting a little feedback. So if people could mute themselves, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you. There's two things going on. On the east side of 155, where I think it's Steve Ryder asked the question. Steve, on the east side of 155, there's a development going in that we had advocated to try and protect that land. That didn't work out. So I don't remember exactly what it is, a tractor trailer warehouse depot type place, I think. But there's a development happening on the east side of 155. On the west side of 155 was an 18-acre black locust stand. So that's, again, non-native invasive trees. And on the east side of the road, that's us restoring pine barrens. And the initial step in that is removing the black locust and then planting the grasses and wildflowers, including lupin, to restore carnival butterfly habitat and create that kind of that youngest successional stage of pine barrens, that the northern successional sampling grassland. We've now done that across, several hundred acres successfully. And it's actually one of the things that helped us build the carnival population back up. So on the west side, that's us pulling weeds and reestablishing pine barrens habitat. On the east side of the road, that's a building of some kind going in.
And Anne is asking, are there any plans to create more places where both wildlife and pedestrians can safely cross the major roads that divide the preserve into pieces? And are the roads less of a problem for butterflies and other insects?
So the first part of your question is yes, conversations have begun, but if that is honestly, one of the biggest ways that Save the Pine Bush and anybody else can help protect the pine bush moving forward is to be advocating for those kinds of crossings, in particular wildlife over and under crossings, so that to help the wildlife move around. The second part of your question, are the roads less of a problem for butterflies and other insects? No. We worked with a PhD student years ago on a carnival butterfly project and realized that the roads, not so much the road itself, but the traffic creates a wall of wind that carnival butterflies and other insects cannot get over. Buck moths, we've seen buck moths fly way up and over tractor trailers, but any insects that stay low to the ground like the way carners do, no, that wind wall is constantly pushing them back. So we marked, for that PhD thesis, we marked about 1,000 butterflies on the Apollo Drive side of 155, and we're able to document 9 crossing events of 1,000 butterflies that we marked. And what we saw as we were trying to stir butterflies and moths into motion to find the ones that we had marked along the roadsides, the butterflies were trying to fly into the road. They'd hit that wall of wind coming off the traffic and just get bounced back. So no, that's long term, right? So the Albany landfill and the habitat restoration work around and on the landfill is helping close what's physically a very large fragmenting feature historically. But we need more of that, especially over and under some of these roads like the Thruway and Route 155, not only to improve wildlife habitat, but also to improve our ability to move around the preserve without, worrying about being hit by cars. It's a great question, Anne. Thank you for asking that.
Also, just to add, Albany County is working on a project to redo Route 155. And I think they had a hearing on it, or no, they had a public meeting on it in January.
Yes.
And I think that the more that people can say, we want accommodations so turtles can cross and snakes can cross and people can cross, it would be better. So
yep, and you should be, and the public should have. It's a great point, Lynn, and the public should have more opportunities as that project unfolds to be voicing those concerns. The New York State DOT is managing the roundabout that's going in and the environmental review for the whole project. So I'm more optimistic than not that some sort of accommodation for wildlife crossing will be part of that project. But that's only going to happen for sure if we keep advocating for it.
That would be great. Let me see. So Bert says, but wish to say your efforts really show blue lupin is much denser and noticeable. Hopefully that means more Carner blue. Thank you. Thank you, Bert.
Yes, thank you, Bert.
Susan asks, what is the geographic range for the new Carner? I'm not sure.
Yeah, for the Carner, I think she means for the Carner blue butterfly. So historically, it covered about 13 states from southern Maine to Minnesota, down into Pennsylvania, northern New Jersey. Currently, it's effectively in Wisconsin, Michigan, New York, and New Hampshire. And the biggest populations and the highest number of populations and some of the biggest populations are in Michigan and Wisconsin. We have 3 populations here in New York and 1 in New Hampshire.
Where are the 3 in New York? There's one.
Sorry?
Where are the 3 Carner blue populations in New York? I mean, there's Albany, and there's
Wilton.
Saratoga Airport.
Oh, right, Saratoga Airport and the Wilton Wildlife Preserve and Park, or the Saratoga Sand Plains Wildlife Management Area that DEC manages in Wilton. They have a very large Carner population, just like we do. I don't know if it's as big because they aren't able to do quite as much monitoring to know, but it's easily in the thousands in Wilton.
So
And a small population at Saratoga Airport, and a very, very small remnant population in Queensbury. And the New York State Parks protected and added about 800 acres to the Moreau State Park on the south side of the Hudson River. And their plan is to restore 800 acres of Carner habitat there.
Wow.
Yep.
Well, that's cool.
And if that's successful, we'll have met statewide recovery criteria for three viable populations, which is huge.
So when Save the Pine Bush did our never-ending hotel lawsuit, in which we started around 2003,
I seem to remember that.
which ended in 2010, there were like 1,000 butterflies in the pine bush in 2000, around 2000, 2001. And now and we thought that the butterflies might not outlast our lawsuit, but there are many more now. How many? Like I couldn't see the whole graph.
Yeah.
So
I'm
how
sorry,
many were counted last summer?
Last summer, the second brood was around 14,000.
Oh, that's good. That's
And
good.
again, that's just in the area we're sampling, which is about 10% to 15% of the occupied habitat.
Oh, that's excellent. Let me see. I don't see another question, but I have questions because I have many questions.
Let's hear it. Go ahead.
Oh, actually, first I have a comment. I appreciated your reference to the 4-acre parcel that you were tasked with ripping up the parking lot.
Yeah.
I just would like to note the reason that 4 acres was used as Carner Blue to grow blue lupin is because Save the Pine Bush sued the town of Guilderland because a developer wanted to build an adventure park there. And even though we lost our lawsuit, the developer ran out of money or whatever happened, and it got sold to the Nature Conservancy. So I just want to
Yes.
say that
Yeah.
that works. Okay, so my question is, the landfill, like the actual original 80-acre landfill, is that being restored? And
Yes.
because my understanding is they were going to put sand on top of it,
Right.
and then, but
Yep.
they put
They are
that
actively working on that. The city has hired some great ecological consultants who are working with a local consulting firm. So they have a great plan for restoring at least native grasslands that can support, Carner blue butterflies and other native species on the landfill. But we didn't want to just take, when the New York State DEC gave them their permit, they required them to establish test plots on the closed landfill. So there's 4 acres of test plots where they tested various depths of sand and soil chemistry to figure out how do we even can they get native plants to grow in the landfill? And I dare say that was incredibly successful. Not only did they get lupin and the native grasses and wildflowers growing on the closed portion of the landfill, Carner blue butterflies and frosted elephant butterflies moved into that by themselves. And we've got
they
rare
moved
turtles
into the landfill by themselves?
Yep, up on top of the old GAL. Yep. There's a rare turtle in the preserve. Then female turtles have gone up on top of the landfill in those test plots to nest. We've got birds up in those 4 acres. So clearly, if you build it, they will come. It's still ultimately a pile of trash, but it will have a veneer of native vegetation on it. It'll no longer be a fragmenting feature between Carner Barrens East and the Rapp Road Barrens. And it'll be able to support a number of the rare species that we're managing for.
Oh, excellent.
Yep.
Okay, I think Russell's next. Can you unmute yourself, Russell? And
Oh, and looks like we got a couple more in the chat too, Lynn, but Russell, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Neil.
Hey, Russell.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the remaining land to be purchased for the preserve. There are about 3,400 acres, and I think there are about 1,900 more that you'd like to acquire. And
Yep. In full protection, I think it's about 15.
15, okay.
1,500 acres. Yep.
All right. It seems like there's an explosion of proposals for the town of Colony, and I was wondering about strategy on how to acquire those how, I mean, we attack proposals, and each of our groups plays different roles, but we definitely need to work together to try to accomplish this. And I was wondering about your forecast for how it may be done and what might actually come out of it all.
Yeah, from our perspective, as you know, we continue to advocate on behalf of the preserve in a slightly different way than you all do. But through our project review, we are reviewing all of those proposals and trying to work to help applicants and the municipalities understand the impacts and trying to offset and minimize those impacts as much as possible. Of course, we work with willing sellers, and if someone is willing to sell us land, then the commission and the New York State DEC, the Nature Conservancy, and increasingly now the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy has been instrumental in helping us add land to the preserve. But ultimately, it relates to trying to help the municipalities understand the impacts on this globally rare ecosystem. So I think we need to keep doing what we've been doing, which is, you know, you all are advocating strongly and utilizing environmental conservation law and the State Environmental Quality Review Act to sue and to try and force people to take the hard look that needs to be taken at some of these proposals. So I hope you will continue to do that work while we continue to do what we do in helping the applicants and municipalities understand the impacts.
I've got just a quick follow-up on that. Like
Sure.
the municipalities that are parts of the commission, Town of Colony, Town of Gifford, City of Albany, their comprehensive plans do not really align themselves well with the commission plan, and they ought to. I mean, their signatories are part of the commission, yet
Sure.
their planning is not. It doesn't.
Right.
Follow.
Well, a part of that, of course, is that they have, you know, as a municipality, they have many, many interests that they're trying to balance as they're evaluating these projects. But both the Town of Colony and the Town of Guilderland have and the City of Albany actually have comprehensive plans that do acknowledge and endorse the commission's management plan, and that is a useful tool for us in particular as we're going and trying to talk to the municipalities and applicants on striking a better balance. And that's really right where the commission and Save the Pine Bush differ, in that you all are very aggressively and often successfully advocating and getting litigious to try and stop some of these developments, and that's your role. Our role is obviously very different, and we're trying to work in a non-confrontational way with commission members, the municipal commission members, and applicants to find an appropriate balance. And sometimes it works, right? There are a number of projects, including one big one up on Loopy Way in the Town of Colony, and several big ones in Guilderland, where as a result of the municipalities, it's a combination of the municipalities' efforts and your efforts, applicants set aside and donated considerable acreage to the preserve while still getting a smaller footprint for their proposed development. And I think hopefully we will continue to see that kind of thing happen as well. But you know, the municipalities have a lot of interests that they're trying to balance. It's not all about the environment, whereas you all and us as well, we are advocating on behalf of the environment. So I think that, again, that is why advocacy is so essential, and why I professionally and personally appreciate the work of the Save the Pine Bush, because you all believe in this strongly enough to get involved and try and make a difference. It doesn't always make the difference that you might always want, but it's still certainly making a difference. And without you, where would we be? We certainly would not have 3,400 and some odd acres protected in the preserve. So I appreciate and hope that Save the Pine Bush continues to stay strong and with a strong membership and continues your important work.
Oh, you're very kind, Neil. Thank you. Let me see. Wendy says, thanks for your work. Are you training people to carry this torch forward? I'm
smiling because our 5 seasonal staff have just started Monday, and I think most of them are on this call. So the answer to that is yes. And as I mentioned earlier, the talk that I gave is one that I was invited to give elsewhere, and I'm now annually, it seems like I'm invited to one regional or national conference after another to talk about our work, because not only is it successful, but people are seeing it as a successful example that can be replicated elsewhere. And they want us to come to fire conferences, conservation biology conferences, natural history conferences to share that story and help train and teach people that, you know, it's not all gloom and doom when it comes to the environment. There's an awful lot of positive things happening and that can happen. And, you know, just like the Lorax, right? If we care, we can make some things happen.
Let me see. Susan Lorillard says, can you speak more about the Mohican connection and how we can publicize?
Yeah, it's something we're only just starting to try and better understand and build on. There's a 20-state fire conference coming to Albany in August, and if all goes well, we will have an Indigenous firekeeping half day at that workshop. So I can't speak a whole lot more about Mohican connections because we are literally at the very beginning stages of trying to build those connections, and not being an Indigenous person, not being an organization, right? We are mostly, almost exclusively, to the best of my knowledge, non-Indigenous, and there's an awful lot of mistrust and negative history and complicated history when it comes to dealing with, you know, these independent Indigenous and sovereign nations. So we are moving very slowly and respectfully to begin building those bridges and building those connections. But in my wildest dreams, I hope that we can help reconnect both the Mohican and the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk tribe nation in particular, with this landscape, because I increasingly we're realizing the way it looks today very closely resembles the way it probably looked pre-contact, before Columbus, you know, discovered the North American continent.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? People are saying very kind things in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
I appreciate. So it's about 7:45 now. Does anyone no more questions? This has been extremely informative, Neil. I really appreciate it. So I think I'll wait just a moment. No more questions. I mean, this was just it. I think what I thought was very interesting is, do you know the answer to this question, which is, so why did the Indigenous people burn the pine bush?
It's a litany of reasons. That's a whole talk by itself. To improve berry production, so fruits like blueberries and blackberries, 2 years after fire, go higher. They were doing an awful lot of fire. They didn't domesticate wildlife per se. They domesticated the landscape with fire, generating forage, and they were hunting with fire to hunt animals, but also burning to produce food for wildlife, so that there was plenty of wildlife for them to be able to harvest and sustain, and not only sustain themselves, but thrive in these environments. We know they were burning to improve hunting, right? Think about walking through, if you've ever walked through the pine bush on a hot, dry summer day, how crunchy it is, particularly if you get off trail through the leaves. So burning frequently maintains low fuel loads, keeps it quieter to walk through. They almost certainly understood the fire risk in a place like the pine bush, and burning it was certainly a matter of reducing just like us, right? Reducing the risk for uncontrolled wildfire. If you're burning it intentionally when it's still a little bit moist and getting reasonable fire behavior, within Indigenous firekeeping, we're learning a lot about what we paraphrase to be the edge of burnability. So kind of like that Goldilocks zone of burning it when it's going to burn, but it's not going to go out of control. Something very similar to what we're doing. So they were burning to try and reduce wildfires. Yeah, an awful lot of reasons. And so if you read Forgotten Fires, which is one of the books that I had posted the cover of, Forgotten Fires is a phenomenal firsthand account of Indigenous nations all across the continent in the 17 and 1800s, why they burned and how they burned. And the list is long of the reasons why they burned, down to burning and managing the edges of wetlands to get new growth for certain species that they would use in basket weaving, making baskets, making milkweeds, spreading dogbane and other very fibrous plants that come back after fire. They would shred that and weave it together the way we spin wool to create fishing lines and make nets and all kinds. Yeah, it's medicinal. So many of the plants in the pine bush have medicinal qualities, so they were basically managing their pharmacy with fire. It's a fascinating study on all the reasons why Indigenous people were burning.
Oh, how interesting. Claire asked if you could repeat the title of the book.
Yep, it's called Forgotten Fires by Omar Stewart.
Forgotten Fires. Oh, that's really interesting.
Let me make sure I got that right. It might be Stewart Omar. Hold on, I'm looking at my slide. Where'd it go? There. Yeah, Forgotten Fires
And the
by
author,
Omar Stewart.
Omar
Yep.
Stewart.
But if you haven't, 1491 is also a phenomenal book. And the other one that talks a little bit about fire, but is just a phenomenal paradigm shift on history, is to read the book titled An Indigenous People's History of the United States. So think about the history of the United States, but told from the perspective of the indigenous nations that were forcibly removed. That's a really great read and an eye-opening account of what happened.
All right. My goodness. Well, I want to thank you so much. This is so interesting. And I just also want to say, if anyone would like to volunteer, because we need to show up, in numbers in Colony, because they seem to be paving their pine bush as fast as they can. So if people want to be part of that, please email me, and that's contact@savethepinebush.org. So contact@savethepinebush.org. Any more questions? I have to say thank you so much, Neil. This has been so informative. And I hate
Thank
to
you, and
take
have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good night.
Thank, wonderful speech. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Anything else on the, anything else coming up soon?
Tomorrow, 38
Right.
Carner Road is going to be at the Albany County Planning Board at 3:30 in the afternoon
In Voorheesville.
in Voorheesville. And what else is coming up? Let me see. I haven't seen anything else on our wonderful Pine Bush agenda. SaveThePineBush.org/agenda. Yeah, I haven't seen anything else. But if anyone else is